So that's basically what's going on there. And unfortunately, Solberg is going beyond the text to paint this story uh, that he's intending. It's really an apologetic move, but it's not an exegetical move. And we're here to refine our exegetics, not do apologetics. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Refining Exegetics, a podcast and biblical studies channel which aims to inspire life-changing interpretation of the Bible and our stories through unique explorations of modern biblical scholarship and ancient wisdom. I'm your host, Jared Casperi. This will be episode 1 of the segment called Refining Exegetics. This segment of the channel is devoted to comparing good scholarship to bad scholarship so that we can be thoroughly equipped to recognize both and seek to emulate good scholarship in our own exegetical studies. In this episode, I will be presenting a typical evangelical Christian reading of Galatians 5:3, as well as 2 alternative exegetical treatments of the text that yield different, and I argue better, more accurate readings. At the end, I will give some thoughts on the practical ramifications, words are hard, of each to how we ought to live. So I was hoping to have my good friend Trey Brickley on with me as a co-host for this episode. Uh, Generally, with these types of episodes, I like to have a dialogue partner to help kind of keep things flowing through and to bounce ideas off of each other and just make things a little bit more natural as opposed to me doing monologue for a while. But here we are. The schedule didn't work out that well for us, so it's just going to be me flying solo for this episode. So what we're going to do is I'm going to bring up a video segment that provides an example of a typical, like I said, evangelical Christian reading of Galatians 5:3, and we'll be focusing on the first half of Galatians 5, from verses 1 through at least around 14 or so, but with special focus on verse 3. And then I'll follow that with a couple of different alternative readings through some other sources. And we'll do a little bit comparing of the two, how each treats the passage, and hopefully be able to use that as a avenue for identifying what can be a good exegetical process, and then some pitfalls that we could run into with bad methods. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get going on the short little video segment. What we have here is a section from a YouTube content creator and teacher named Rob Solberg, and he heads up a channel called the Biblical Roots, and he spends a lot of his channel on apologetics for defending a position, and particularly in reaction to what you might call pronomian teachers and pronomian readings of the Bible, readings of Paul, readings of the New Testament, maybe also what you might broadly call Messianic Judaism or Paul within Judaism types of readings or scholarship. And Rob Solberg has spent a lot of his time and energies on arguing against those types of readings. He sees that there's danger in what he would lump a lot of that into what is sometimes called Hebrew roots. And I don't want to get into that in this video. I think that's an unfair characterization of that you can't really lump pronomian, Messianic Judaism, Hebrew roots, what he would call Torahism into just one lump sum group, like as if it's kind of monolithic and they're all saying the same sort of things and arguments. That's something that he does quite often, but that's a little beside the point, but just giving some background info on that. So he's going to be presenting his, this is a portion of his, what he calls an apologetics Bible study. I don't want to front load this too much with my own thoughts and opinions. That I'm not trying to sway you listeners towards in other words, I'm not trying to poison the well, but just whenever somebody is presenting something and they're calling it an apologetics Bible study, I'm going to say that my expectation is that I'm not going to be viewing something that's very rigorous and well thought out and utilizing exegetical principles to any consistent degree. The reason being is because apologetics tends to be an endeavor in presupposing beliefs and then trying to defend those beliefs using the Bible. And that doesn't really lend itself to a well executed biblical studies work. There's a lot of pitfalls that one can fall into, and I think we'll kind of identify some of that as we go. So right here, he is just, I'm starting at a few minutes in. He has just laid out kind of a summation of what his conclusions have been thus far, and now he's getting into chapter 5 of Galatians.
Heirs through faith in Jesus. And then he continues in chapter 5, verse 1. For freedom Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. Look, I, Paul, say to you that if you accept circumcision, Christ will be of no advantage to you. I testify again to every man who accepts circumcision that he is obligated to keep the whole law. You are severed from Christ, you who would be justified by the law. You have fallen away from grace. For through the Spirit, by faith, we ourselves eagerly await for the hope of righteousness. For in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision counts for anything, but only faith working through love. Paul says, look, the Greek interjection is either, behold, take note, right? It's like a modern day pastor saying, hey, all eyes up here. And he says, I, Paul, say to you, so he's putting every ounce of apostolic authority that he has behind his statement that if you accept circumcision, Christ will be of no advantage to you. And Paul's obviously talking about circumcision in its ritual form, not simply the medical procedure. He's saying, hey, in case your mind has been wandering while you've been reading this letter, let me draw you back to the point. Don't miss this. And to truly understand the weight of the statement he's making here, we need to view it in the historical and theological context of his first century audience, where circumcision was a really big deal. It was one of, if not the, most significant aspects of one's identity as a people of the covenant. So let's take a quick sidebar to make sure we understand the history of circumcision in the Torah.
So, quick thought. What he's going to do now is he's going to go to the Torah, to various passages that speak of circumcision in regards to what is found in the Torah. Now, this is a interpretive move on his part that already has made some assumptions in the text that I'm going to compare with the alternative exegetical sources or exegetical works, and you'll see that it's almost like Rob Solberg here is he's already made an interpretive decision, and he's going to allow that interpretive decision to direct where he's going to go in order to answer, first to ask questions and then answer those questions. Whereas we'll find as I present alternative readings that already at this point we haven't even gotten really far. What is circumcision referring to? Now, Solberg's presupposition, the interpretive direction that he's working off of is that circumcision obviously is in regards to the commandment and the law of Moses. Whereas there are other interpretive options for what quote unquote circumcision refers to. But Solberg doesn't appear to be granting any of those options. He appears to be presenting to his listeners as this is the only option. He doesn't talk about any other option. And that's a clue. That's an indication that we're getting into some bad scholarship. Bad scholarship, one indication is that an interpretive approach does not weigh, even if you've made a particular commitment to interpret a passage or go to a certain direction with your process, that if you're not willing to weigh that decision with other options that are on the table, then what you're doing is you're not providing your listeners with a full picture. In a sense, you're playing on possibly the ignorance of your listeners, and that they'll presume that, well, if you're not presenting any other options, then, well, must be the only reading that there is. Solberg doesn't do that by and large in his Apologetics Bible study, because he's really presupposing the thing that he's wanting to defend, and he's just going all in on that. And so, without belaboring that point anymore, let's continue. So what he's going to do is he's going to go to various places in the Torah to try to paint this picture of what circumcision is, what it means, and why Paul is against it.
The rite of circumcision is actually introduced twice in the Torah. First with Abraham. So remember, Genesis 15 tells us that Abraham believed God and his faith was counted to him as righteousness. And then 2 chapters later in Genesis 17, circumcision was given as a sign of God's covenant with Abraham. Now, just a few years after Paul wrote this letter to the Galatians, he explains Abraham's circumcision further and in more detail, in his letter to the churches in Rome. In Romans chapter 4, Paul picks up this same idea and unpacks it a little bit more. And he explains why Abraham was circumcised. Verse 9. For we say that faith was counted to Abraham as righteousness. How then was it counted to him? Was it before or after he had been circumcised? It was not after, but before he was circumcised. Okay, and why was Abraham circumcised? He received the sign of circumcision as a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith, while he was still uncircumcised. The purpose was to make him the father of all who believe without being circumcised, so that righteousness would be counted to them as well, and to make him the father of the circumcised, who are not merely circumcised, but who also walk in the footsteps of the faith that our father Abraham had before he was circumcised. Okay, so circumcision is first introduced in the Torah as a seal of the righteousness that Abraham had by faith. So at that point, circumcision stood for justification by faith. But by the time we get to Moses, circumcision is reintroduced and it's given additional significance. For a person to be circumcised under the law of Moses, it not only carried with it that meaning of faith that came down from Abraham, because that was never lost, but it also now included a commitment to the Sinai covenant and an obligation to keep the Mosaic law. So circumcision meant a lot more under Moses than it originally did back in the days of Abraham.
All right, stop there for a moment. So obviously he's going through starting with Abraham, Genesis 17, and then trying to paint this story where circumcision had this initial meaning under Abraham, but then in Moses it gets intensified and gets added on additional meaning or significance. He doesn't appear to back this up anywhere in the text. It's not apparent in just reading through the Torah that circumcision takes on this quote unquote additional significance. It would appear to be something that was given as covenant to Abraham for identifying his physical offspring. In other words, his family. And it continued through the line of Isaac and Jacob, who was renamed Israel, and thus became an identifier of the people of Israel, the children of Israel, in other words, the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. When we get to the Sinai covenant in Exodus, and particularly like Leviticus, I want to say 12. It's either 12 or 13, somewhere in there. I'll have to look it up. It's reiterated, but there's not any indication that there's additional meaning. It seems to be just something that's reiterated, something from what God has given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, now just subsumed under an additional covenant. I'm not sure why he feels that that's an accurate way to describe that, or to how he's painting the story, and so that is a little bit of a concern here as we move forward. I'm going to jump ahead just a little bit. He's going to talk about now that the law of Moses commanded all Gentiles to be circumcised. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. Let's see, it's about right
there. And remember, in the Torah, Gentiles who were sojourning with Israel were also required to be circumcised if they wanted to partake in the Israelite feasts like Passover. So circumcision was an essential part of life and faith under the Mosaic covenant. Okay.
So this is not accurate, really. There's one instance, one situation in particular, in Exodus 12, where the requirement for circumcision is is spoken of in regards to a sojourner in your midst. And that's a sojourner who wishes to eat specifically of the Pesach lamb, and it could be in regards to the Pesach meal, the larger meal memorial portion of the Moedim, or of that Moed of Pesach. And so there's a couple things to note. First, what it does say, and also what it doesn't say. What it does say is that, I could pull it up here. Let's just go here. Exodus 12. So from 43, and the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, this is the statute of the Passover, uh, also called Pesach. No foreigner shall eat of it. Remember, we're talking about no foreigner shall eat of it. We're not even talking, so we're right from the get-go, we're not even talking about uh any of the other Moedim. We're talking about Pesach, Passover. And specifically we're talking about eating of it. Now there's more to Pesach, obviously, than eating a meal. There's in both in the initial event itself and in the memorialization of it every year since. In both cases, you have the people sort of in vigil, waiting for the Lord to deliver them the actual event of them going out under the mighty and strong hand of the Lord. And you have the um, all the remembrances of the uh, and the pointing to the suffering of the people under bondage and God's deliverance. Uh, the meal is an important part of that, but it's not the only part. It's not the Passover is not a meal by itself. It's an event that involved a meal, and that meal, I would say, the way that I've come to see or make sense of this is that the meal was particularly a memorial uh, of that was a memorial of God's deliverance of his firstborn son. In several places in Exodus, up to this point, Israel, the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, are identified as God's firstborn son. And so the meal, the lamb particularly, which was a symbol of God's redemption of the firstborn, and that was something that was a prerogative of the children of Israel to partake of that meal, not only in the initial event, but also in the 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 generations to come, as an everlasting ordinance that they would observe this feast in remembrance of the Exodus from Egypt. And so we're talking about eating of something. So moving on in verse 44, but every slave that is bought for money may eat of it after you have circumcised him. Again, we're talking about eating of it. If a uh now we're talking about specifically a slave. Now, if we jump back to Genesis 17, the instruction to Abraham was uh involved, there were four categories of people that were listed there that fell under this covenant of circumcision. And it's only the last category that ever mentions any Gentile. And the only Gentile mentioned there is a household slave that was either born in the household or bought with money from the nations. Uh, and the easiest way of of making sense of that is that uh, a a slave that came into the family of Abraham would have been considered as a legitimate son, would have taken on a bit of that status, and thus would then have been circumcised as the having that mark of a, in a sense, identifying as if it's physical descendant. And that's why we have here in verse 44, it is um, a slave may eat of it after you have circumcised him. So the language here, we don't have the language of everybody must eat this meal and therefore everybody must be circumcised. No, what we have is if a person who is not already circumcised, in other words, i.e., not a child of Isaac, or sorry, a son of Israel, but is a foreigner, whether a slave or just a foreigner, a ger who has attached himself to Israel, who isn't circumcised, if they want to eat at the Passover meal, they may. They just first have to be circumcised because the meal is a memorial of God's firstborn son who are circumcised. And it would be presumptuous for a non-Israelite to take it upon himself to eat of that meal because he's not of the firstborn of Israel or firstborn of God. So that's sort of that's basically the situation that we have here. Going on, no foreigner or hired worker may eat of it. It shall be eaten in one house. You shall not take any of the flesh outside the house, and you shall not break any of its bones. All the congregation of Israel shall keep it. If a stranger shall sojourn with you and would keep the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised. Then he may come near and keep it. He shall be as a native of the land, but no uncircumcised person shall eat of it. So the text is already specifying to us, readers and listeners, uh, what this is entailing. Uh, if a person wants to eat the Passover meal, that male would need, and their males would need to be circumcised. There shall be one law for the native and for the stranger who sojourns among you. Uh, what Soberg is doing is then extrapolating this out to say that, well, if it's any of the feasts of the Lord, that person has to be circumcised. No, we're talking about one feast. We're talking about Pesach. And specifically, we're talking about in regards to eating of the meal. So this is a extremely limited situation that's delineated for us in the text, and it doesn't give any indication that we're supposed to uh, extrapolate that out to other domains or other situations. And there's a specific reason, because this feast, and specifically the meal portion of this feast, is specifically a memorial of God's deliverance of his firstborn son. And so you would have to be a firstborn son or have that covenantal mark in your flesh in order to partake of that. So that's basically what's going on there. And unfortunately, Solberg is going beyond the text to paint this story that he's intending. It's really an apologetic move, but it's not an exegetical move. And we're here to refine our exegetics, not do apologetics. So let's continue on. Let's go back to there. Where's my window? There we go. And I'm not sure if we're going to go anymore.
So let's head back to Galatians. Paul's admonition about circumcision here in Galatians 5 further underscores that the Mosaic covenant was no longer in effect. In fact, things had changed dramatically. I mean, circumcision was a requirement under Moses. And Paul doesn't simply say,
Wow. Okay. Uh, it's a huge interpretive step that Silver makes here without any sort of textual analysis or support to make said step. He goes from Paul's apparently going to say something that circumcision is not required anymore. Therefore, the entire Mosaic covenant is not required, and is uh, that folks, we can't do stuff like that. This is lazy. Uh, the Paul gives no indication at all that he's making the sort of connection that Solberg is making here. And unfortunately, Solberg has spent so much time uh, glossing over the text in order to create this story that it's going to cause huge problems here in a moment. Not the least of which he is uh, it's throwing the baby out with the bathwater. If circumcision is that which is tied direct is if circumcision Paul is talking about here is the circumcision that is commanded in the law of Moses, and Paul is essentially uh, removing that requirement, uh, and then the conclusion of that is also the law of Moses is removed or is no longer valid or no longer required, as Solberg is putting it here. Uh, it's a that's a that's an exegetical problem, and it creates more problems than it's actually going to solve.
say it's no longer required. He says that under the new covenant, the acceptance of the Mosaic rite of circumcision actually undermines the value of what Jesus did for us. And he adds in verse 3 that if we want to be circumcised for ritual reasons, it means we're obligated to keep the whole law. And he doesn't say that in a positive sense. Remember, Paul has...
Keep in mind, quick note here, and this will come into play as we look at the alternative options. Solberg grants just right off the bat presumes that this obligated to keep the whole law, as it's in this English translation, it's a negative. In other words, he's presuming that Paul is saying, look, if you accept circumcision, oh man, it's not going to be good for you. You're going to have to keep the whole law, and we all know how that ends. It's bad. You don't want to obligate yourself to that because it's impossible. So that's a little bit of the headspace that he's operating in, and it's causing him to read this expression, the statement, in not a positive sense, in a negative sense. And we'll see that this is not a good way to go.
been laboring the point for the past 4 chapters that the law is not how we're made right with God.
At this point, it's going to be hard for me to not pause after every single sentence, because every single sentence from this point on is basically going to be exact opposite of what the Bible says. Explicit statements from Paul himself contradicting what Solberg is going to be saying here. And so that it just cascades downhill and it gets even worse and worse with more contradictions as he goes. And this is why it's just indicative of apologetics and not starting with the right frame of reference. He makes a statement here that the law is not how we are made right with God. In other words, the law is not how we are justified before God. Well, hold on, Solberg. We go to Romans 2, verse 13. Paul makes an explicit statement that's not ambiguous, that can't be taken multiple ways. He says quite clearly that it's not the hearers of the law who are righteous before God, but it is the doers of the law who will be declared righteous. Um, that's a problem, Solberg. If you're going to say that the law is not how we are made right with God, I mean, you could say the law doesn't make you right with God. I mean, that could be one um way of putting something, because it's the law doesn't, like, it's not an agent. It doesn't like do stuff to you. It doesn't save you, and because it's not a sentient personal being that can save or preserve. Um, God is the one who preserves, and he does so according to his word. He he preserves the one who trusts in him, who keeps his commandments. He's God saves the one who does the law, not just hearing the law, but uh, going and doing the law. God saves. It's God who vindicates, uh, who takes somebody who uh, maybe the verdict is, or the jury is still out on, and there's maybe accusations brought against somebody, but it's God who vindicates them when they are shown that they are in the right. They've been obedient, they've been faithful to the commandments, and God renders the decision. You are justified when you act and when you in what you're doing, because it's in accordance with my word, with my ways. Uh, so God is the one who justifies, and he justifies those who do the law, just as it is written. It is not the hearers of the law who are righteous before God, but it is the doers of the law who will be declared righteous. But again, you're saying something exact opposite of that, it appears. So here we go.
As we saw in previous episodes, he compares the law to slavery and imprisonment and a curse.
Yep. It's getting worse. It's he's uh there's nowhere in Galatians where Paul equates the law or compares the law to slavery, imprisonment, and a curse. What he does is he says in Galatians 3:10 that all those who are of works of law are under a curse. And the reason being is because they're not doing the things written in the book of the law. They're actually doing a tradition and creating their own set of ordinances that they're going to justify themselves by, creating a righteousness of their own. That's why those who are of works of law are under curse. Uh, and I don't have, it's not my goal to go into in-depth presentation of what works of law is. There is no such thing as works of the law in Galatians, at least not, yeah, at least not in this uh, passage. There's not, well, actually, Paul never uses the phrase the works of the law. That's not a phrase that's ever found in the Bible. What you have is works of law, and that has a specific referent to a body of traditions uh, that were created to delineate uh, through man-made tradition and regulations those who would be in covenant versus those who aren't in covenant. Uh, Again, that's not the point of this channel or point of this episode, but I do hope to present that in the near future. So, but I think we just on a basic level, we can uh, begin to ask ourselves, wait, where is this coming from? Where Solberg is saying that Paul compares the law to slavery, imprisonment, and a curse. Um, if you're thinking about this and you're thinking about the Sinai covenant and you're thinking about where in the story of redemption the Sinai covenant comes in, God had just delivered Israel out of the house of bondage, out of the slavery, um, and out of suffering, out from under the yoke of the gods and the rulers of Egypt. He's bringing them to the mountain, has delivered them from all that, and now he's going to give them another form of slavery, an another imprisonment. He's going to place curses on them. I mean, I mean, that's obviously, uh, if the law is slavery, imprisonment, and a curse, then uh, what does that say about the character of Hashem, of Yod He Vav He, the God of Israel, our God, who would take a people out of slavery, uh, only to bring them into an even greater form of slavery? It this is ludicrous on so many levels. So it's kind of baffling to me, and this is common. This is a common interpretive step that evangelical Christians make, based off of the type of teaching that you're hearing here, and which is why it's so important that I'm going to present different a different process for reading this passage that doesn't lead to ridiculous entailments like this. So I think we just got a little bit more to go.
Yet, for the Judaizers and for our Hebrew roots friends today, keeping the whole law is what they aspire to. But Paul is speaking of it in negative terms. He says that if we accept circumcision, Christ is of no advantage to us. The acceptance of the Mosaic rite of circumcision as a means of being made right with God is an insult to the work of Christ. So in chapter 5, Paul's saying, for freedom Christ has set you free. So don't put yourself back under the bondage of the Mosaic law. If you want to be made right in God's eyes through circumcision, the ESV says in verse 4, you are severed from Christ, which is a nice wordplay on the idea of circumcision. But the Greek word there is katario, which means abolish or set aside or wipe out. Remember in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus famously said, I have not come to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them. And
I think that's probably, I'm not going to go much further on that. Let me come back here for a second. Stop. Okay, so just a quick summary of Solberg's points before we go on to the other exegetical sources. His views that Paul is bringing in that these Gentiles are trying to be circumcised according to the law of Moses, or that they're being compelled to be circumcised according to the law of Moses, and that this decision would separate them or sever them from Christ. He doesn't, Solberg doesn't explain or give any reason for why Paul is connecting circumcision here with being severed from Christ, aside just from the assertion, without any exegetical evidence, that, well, you're not trusting in grace, and you're trying to do the whole law, and we all know that the whole law is negative. It's a bad thing, and that it will lead to curse and imprisonment and slavery and all that. So why are you people trying to do that? It, it's a little weird because he doesn't really spend a whole lot of time on verse 1 that says, for freedom Christ set you free, so do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. Well, there's an important word there, again. And if circumcision is part being presented here is part of the law of Moses, and well, you have a problem. The Gentiles who are encompassing Paul's audience here have never been, nor do they even really know the law of Moses. They're Gentiles. They're coming from pagan culture who doesn't know. I mean, they're strangers to the covenants and promises and the Torah. So how could Paul be saying to these Gentiles who have never been obligated to the law of Moses, telling them, look, don't submit again to the law of Moses? It just it doesn't work rhetorically, contextually, culturally. It's just it doesn't work at all. But this is sort of a blind spot because you're just taking bits and pieces of the text and you're trying to plug them into the story that you're telling. Uh, and it blinds you to the blatant contradictions that you're then creating. I honestly don't think Solberg connects his storytelling of the law of Moses and the whole law being a yoke of slavery. He's not uh this is what happens when you don't take enough data points from the text to properly situate and create a good picture. And then you could, because once you've done that, then you could take uh that picture or those group of data points and correlate them with other data points elsewhere in the text that have connection. And then this is what where I would call it, this is where hermeneutics begins, is you kind of develop a framework that then brings all these data points together. What he's doing is he's starting with a narrative, and then he's picking some data points here to support that narrative. All the while, now he's got a huge problem with the data points in Exodus and the deliverance of Israel and bringing them to Mount Sinai to give them such amazing laws that the nations are supposed to look. It's like, what God is this who, uh, what other nation has such a God who gives his people such amazing laws, commandments, and statutes as this God and this people? Um, that doesn't sound like um, a yoke of bondage. That doesn't sound like a people who are, I mean, that's like, oh, that, I don't want that. Um, they're not saying stuff like that in the Torah. Um, Certainly the the psalmist in Psalm 119 is not saying stuff like that. So it creates a lot of problems. So now I'm going to here, let's do this. Okay. I'm going to bring up a commentary. This is uh, from a exegetical work called Misunderstanding Galatians, an exegetical originalist commentary by M.I. Cha. And we're going to be treating the same passage and looking at his reading and his treatment of it. And I think you're going to see right off the bat quite a different treatment than what Solberg is providing. So let's pull that up. All right, so commentary in Galatians 5. So here's this translation. Behold, I, Paul, say to you that if you receive circumcision, Christ will be of no benefit to you. And I testify again to every man who receives circumcision that he is under obligation to keep the whole law. You have been severed from Christ, you who are seeking to be justified by law. You have fallen from grace. For we, through the Spirit by faith, are waiting for the hope of righteousness. For in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision means anything, but faith working through love. And that's verses 2 through 6. Um, so his comments follows. As in 2, 3, circumcision in this section again, we're putting it in quotes because we don't want to assume we understand what circumcision means. And he's already done a lot of exegetical work up to this point to come to the conclusion that he has here. Actually, I'm going to stop sharing here for a second. Yeah. Uh, Circumcision in this section refers not to the biblical requirements first described in Genesis 17, but to the official rite that was a part of the sanctioned process of Gentile proselyte conversion, according to the broader Jewish law and Pharisaic authority. If the Galatian believers underwent proselyte conversion into Pharisaic Judaism, the Messiah's teaching, example, and ministry would become useless. So right off the bat, this is where exegesis departs from apologetics. Exegesis is taking in a lot more intertextual data and historical data to draw the conclusion that circumcision is a metonym for an entire proselyte process, whereby Gentiles were compelled that if they wanted to be really considered part of the covenant assembly and not a second rate individual or somebody that was not fully associated with, they were compelled to go through a proselyte conversion process to basically become a Jew. And that culminated in circumcision. And it had a whole body of regulations and halachic ordinances uh, delineating that process. Uh, and it bound the persons who went through that under the authority of the Pharisaic body that um, was legislating that process. This comes through a lot of what has come to light through various Jewish sources, and I um, one bit of information that I think is pertinent that I think there's still a little bit of debate on, but it's almost something that uh, is not really debated anymore, is the connection of Paul's ergon nomu, works of law, with what was found, a collection of documents that were found in one of the caves at Qumran. And the it was found in the fourth cave. And it's in Hebrew, the title of the document is Miksat Mahaseh HaTorah, and roughly translates to some deeds of the Torah. And what you find therein is a list of regulations that that particular community had uh, given as the requirements for being a member of the community. And I don't have time to dive into that, but there's instances in that document where you have ordinances that actually are almost the opposite of the actual words in the law of Moses. And what you have is their halachic interpretations of from sectarian groups that um, are interpreting how one actually is to keep the law of Moses. Um, but some often what we find, and we find this in the Gospels, that Yeshua confronted certain traditions that actually violated the commandments. And that's that's the backdrop to places like Mark 7, where Yeshua says to the Pharisees, Isaiah speaks well of you, um, or speaks accurately of you, how you set to naught the commandments of God for the sake of your traditions. And they had certain traditions that they took as more important, and they neglected weightier matters of the law in order to pursue those traditions. And it again, that's a righteousness of their own. They're seeking to justify themselves apart from obedience to the commandments of God. And so that really does become pertinent here as we go on. Let's see. Okay. And if they undergo the process of proselyte conversion through the rite of circumcision, they will be obligated to observe the entirety of the Jewish law, including the Pharisaic oral traditions. The phrase "olan ton nomu," the whole law, and that's in 5:3, does not refer to flawless perfectionism, but to everything a religious Jew of Paul's time was expected to do, including the oral traditions of the Jewish elders and the rulings of the Sanhedrin. In other words, how they would interpret uh, the mitzvot. That's what the phrase circumcision refers to, and then being obligated to the whole law. In other words, uh, the definite article in that phrase, the whole law, is in this reading is being used as an anaphoric article. Anaphoric just simply means that it's like instead of saying the whole law, it's that whole law. It's in this. It's how we would use that when we've already mentioned something like a car came and smashed into a guardrail, and then you're later on in the same narrative, you're saying that car. Um, so you, in other words, it cues the people in that you're referring to the something that you've already just talked about. You're not talking about something different, and so that's an anaphoric use of the definite article. And so, what this interpretation, this treatment is saying is that if you receive circumcision, you'll be obligated to that whole body of law that uh, that legislates the proselyte conversion process. So if there's to be read that phrase in a negative sense, it's in the sense that uh, the teachers, the ones who are teaching and presenting this doctrine, this dogma to the Gentiles and compelling them to go through this process, they're not telling them the whole story. There may be saying, "Oh, you just need this is what you need to do initially," but then they don't realize that that process binds them by oath to an entire body of halakhic regulations. Um, so this interpretation is taking it, yes, in a negative light, but it's not in reference to the law of Moses. It's actually something different, and that's very important. Let's see. Thus, that whole law in 5:3 does not refer to obeying the biblical law of God, but to compliance with the religious system of Pharisaic Judaism. Having undergone proselyte conversion, the Galatian believers would then come under the spiritual authority of Pharisaic Judaism and thus be severed from Christ. This is something that he's building on. He had already, the author of this work, Cha is his last name, Cha. Uh, he had spent some time developing a reading wherein in chapter 2 where Paul says that through law I died to law. Uh, and in the same vein, he's talking about being crucified with Christ. Uh, it's the picture that he's painting is contextually it's Yeshua's rub with up against these Pharisaic traditions that was one of the main impetuses for his crucifixion, for him to be delivered over to the Gentiles and crucified. Um, it was a power struggle, and they felt that their power, their authority was being threatened by Yeshua, and so they got rid of him through crucifixion. And so that's what Paul is calling law, where he says, it doesn't say through the law I died to law or died to the law. That's what most English translations say, but the literal translations that don't gloss over the fact that there's no definite article there, he's Paul is saying that just in the same way that Yeshua was delivered up, and through this tradition, he became a victim and died to law. Paul is taking the same journey, and he's dying to that law, um, so that he himself could be freed from man-made regulations and traditions, these oral traditions that actually are a bondage. Um, is We should be thinking about Yeshua's words, where he says that, uh, you hypocrites, you brood of vipers, you tie heavy burdens, and put them on the shoulders of others, and you yourselves do not lift a finger to help them. And well, I think contextually we could say that that's referring to these regulations, these Pharisaic halakhic regulations that are part of a larger body of uh, ordinances that are man-made traditions that do cause a heavy burden upon the people. And so verse 4, you have fallen from grace. So this is an alternate expression to describe the preceding alienation from the Messiah. So the reason why, um, under this reading, this makes rhetorical sense, and it's actually a very powerful rhetorical device that Paul is using. If it is the case that it's this law, this tradition that led to the crucifixion of Yeshua, and Paul himself is dying to that, as well, then for these Gentiles to then come under that authority and be compelled to go through that process to bind themselves to that tradition that Yeshua himself died to, that would be the impetus for Paul saying that they've fallen from grace and that they're alienated from the Messiah. The Messiah came to break down that dividing wall of hostility that we're getting into Ephesians 2 here. That wall of hostility was these very traditions that had set up a boundary marker, um, contrary to the law of Moses, uh, to a set of traditions that had put a stark separation between Jews and Gentiles and caused hostility, where the law of Moses didn't direct such a hostility. And so these Gentiles would become alienated from Messiah, and his work and his teaching would be of no effect, because they're essentially denying uh, what Messiah has done in breaking down that barrier. These Gentiles are rather, they would be establishing that barrier, building it up again. Paul says earlier in Galatians 2 that if I raise up what I had torn down, I prove myself to be a sinner. Um, and that's speaking again of this uh, wall of hostility that had been torn down through Messiah. Um, but that's a lot there. This is already becoming a very long video, but this is good. I think we need to work through this and see how. So in contrast, you see how rhetorically this is all fitting together and there aren't contradictions being made. When we understand that Paul is making a distinction throughout his epistles between the law of Moses and works of law. In other words, circumcision, this proselyte conversion, this trusting and boasting in a righteousness that they're creating of their own making. And uh, that alleviates or keeps us from these contradictions that Solberg is creating through his reading. Uh, if we don't pay attention to this rhetorical flow, then we'll read passages like Romans 2:13 and Romans 3:20, which appear to be saying exact opposite statements. Romans 2:13 says, "It's not the hearers of the law who will be justified, but the doers of the law who will be declared righteous before God." And then you get to next chapter 3:20, and Paul is saying, uh, "By observing works of law shall no flesh be justified." Well, that's a that's a problem. That's a blatant contradiction. Those are contradictory statements if those are talking about the same thing. And what this reading does is eliminate that contradiction, and it just flows beautifully. The reason why that Solberg doesn't provide a explanation for how his reading makes sense of them being alienated from Messiah, other than just to assert this idea of grace being opposed to the law of Moses, uh, which is not something that the Bible explicitly says. It's not a teaching anywhere, much less in Paul. Whereas here, it's quite obvious the reason why they're being alienated from Messiah is because, well, it's those traditions and that wall of hostility that led to the death of Yeshua. And for these Gentiles to then um, abide by that tradition and follow it and come under that authority, they're making the death of Messiah of no effect. It means nothing, basically. It's like what I, Yeshua is. It would be like Yeshua is saying, "I just I tore down that thing, that hostility between you and the Jews that had been built up over many years of this tradition." Uh, does that mean nothing? In other words, um, so moving on uh, in the commentary, in contrast to the legalism of Pharisaic Judaism, seeking to be justified through the Holy Spirit by faithfulness, verse 5 is characterized as uh, the grace. This difference is akin to the grace of the Messiah's light and easy yoke of law, Matthew 11:29 through 30, versus his opponent's yoke of slavery. So there you have that. Uh, there's more that could be said, but so in summary, with this uh, treatment, how Cha is exegeting the text is he's recognizing, or he's working off the textual data that lends itself to circumcision being a metonym for something that's different than the law of Moses. And it's by that fact that when there are those who are of that tradition and who are compelling others to come into that tradition, it's actually violating the law of Moses, hence putting them under a curse. It's granted that people should be obeying the law of Moses in this reading, uh, and I think that does make a lot of sense of Paul's uh, first century context. So the other, let me bring it back to here. Okay. The other reading or interpretation that I want to present is a little bit different than that. And it hinges on a different reading of the so to speak negative obligated to obey the whole law. And what this comes down to is essentially rhetorically, the rhetorical device here Paul is saying here in verse uh in chapter 5 verse 3 is, look, I testify again that you who would receive circumcision are obligated to the whole law. And here this reading would be a reference to the law of Moses. uh, and the reason why this would make great rhetorical sense is based on rhetorically, uh, it's there's a lot of connection with the previous exegetical treatment that I presented, uh, that takes for granted that circumcision as a metonym for this process that was never commanded in the law of Moses. In fact, the law of Moses never commanded that all Gentiles had to be circumcised in order to be considered covenant members. You never find that in the law of Moses. Um, what you do, in fact, find is foreigners joining themselves to the Lord, and the basis of them being considered as part of the family is that they're keeping God's covenant and his not profaning the Sabbath. This is Isaiah 56, by the way, famous passage. But to the point, let me gather my thoughts here. Yes. So under this third reading, Paul is essentially saying rhetorically, uh, this circumcision process and you becoming an ethnic Jew, identifying as a Jew, is not going to help you because you're still obligated to the whole law. And in fact, by doing this, you're actually violating the law. And he goes, and this sort of makes sense because when you go on to, um, let's find it here. Where am I? Okay. Let's go to that. Share my screen really quick here. Okay. For through the Spirit by faithfulness, I pistis is really uh it can really be just faithfulness. It's allegiance, um, steadfastness. We ourselves eagerly await for the hope of righteousness. For in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision counts for anything, but only faith working through love. Um, the reason why this is important is because Paul says the exact same expression, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision counts for anything, in another passage. He says the exact phrase in 1 Corinthians 7:19. But instead of saying, but only faith working through love, he ends it out with, but keeping the commandments of God. For in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision counts for anything, but rather keeping the commandments of God is what counts, is what 1 Corinthians 7:19 says. So what we could do is, by collating the first half of the expression, both here and in 1 Corinthians 7:19, we can say that faith working through love just is keeping the commandments of God. Or we could say the only way that you can really be working to have faithfulness working through love is by keeping the commandments of God. Well, if we take Solberg's reading that circumcision is regarding the commandment that God gave through Moses, essentially Paul is saying another contradictory statement here. He would be saying that for in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision counts for anything, but keeping the commandments is what counts. Well, Solberg, if circumcision is one of the commandments, then he's saying that circumcision doesn't count, but it does. It's because circumcision is one of the commandments of God. That's what you would have to say, and that's the sort of contradiction, the messiness that you would fall into rhetorically, that you be committing Paul to under Solberg's reading. It just doesn't work to say that circumcision, which is a commandment of God, is nothing apparently anymore. But and keeping the commandments of God is everything. It just uh that's contradictory, and it's sort of nonsensical. But if we understand that circumcision or uncircumcision is in regards to proselyte conversion, then it makes sense, because that's not in the law of Moses and that wasn't a commandment of God. So it doesn't matter if you are Gentile and you took on this mark and you decided to go through that, that doesn't make you righteous. And if you already have that mark and you consider yourself a Jew, that doesn't make you righteous either. Whether you go through it or you've been through it or you undo it, neither of them makes you righteous. The only thing that is justifies is doing the commandments of God. So continuing on down, so that's rhetorically, that also works with this positive outlook of verse 3, where Paul says, I testify again to every man who accepts circumcision that he is obligated to keep the whole law. And this becomes important rhetorically because of what he does in verse 13. For you were called to freedom, brothers, only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. Where is he going with this? Where are you going with this, Paul? Oh, back to the law of Moses. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But if you bite and devour one another, watch out that you are not consumed by one another. So through this doctrine, this dogma, this tradition, it's actually causing, because it's not something rooted in the law of Moses, but through man-made tradition, it's causing dissensions, it's causing division, it's causing people to bite and devour one another. One doesn't need to speculate much about why that would be. It's because you would have one group coming in and their tradition says, no, you need to do it this way. But then you have another group coming in and their tradition says, no, you're wrong. You got to do it this way. You're not truly circumcised because you didn't do it this way. Well, you're not circumcised because you didn't do it our way. You're biting and devouring one another at that point. You're causing division, dissensions over something that is actually it's different than the law of Moses. So that's why rhetorically, again, this and the exegetical commentary that I read from, both, though, I think these are the only two options that are on the table as far as how to read this passage. Solberg's reading it's not even on the table. It doesn't even get off the ground, rhetorically speaking, exegetically speaking, culturally speaking. It's a non-starter. And so I have no qualms in calling that bad scholarship. So let's see. All right, well, I think that will be it for this episode. Let me close that out. Okay. So what I hope that this is what I've accomplished here is uh, to provide a couple of options that are on the table for reading Galatians 5:3 that don't end up in the traditional evangelical reading that causes so many problems um, for understanding Paul in his first century context. Now, what I want to do is take a brief moment here to to present what I think are some ramifications, some entailments of if we're going to apply Solberg's reading of the passage to our lives, um, what what would that entail? What does that lead to? Well, I want to say up front that um, the reading that Solberg presents in his interpretive framework is itself a man-made tradition. It doesn't appear to be something that congeals well with the text of the Bible. It's mainly presuppositions and statements and assertions uh, that are taken for granted, and then certain passages are uh, utilized in order to support that. And it smells to me of a doctrine in search of a text. Um, and what happens is, well, that to me is a righteousness of your own. Your uh, it's um, it's creating your own man-made tradition, and then using that as a basis of righteousness to say that, well, if you accept this teaching, um, and uh, uh, then that's the basis of righteousness. And if you believe something different, then you're actually trusting in yourself. Um, Yada yada yada. There's a lot of polemical games that are played around that uh, framework. And the other thing that I want to say is that, um, well, yeah, I would just say that that's works of law. Uh, in the same way that the Pharisees and certain Jewish sects had created their own set of regulations that would mark themselves out as the true people of God. I think this sort of dogma of grace versus the law is of the same type. Uh, just as the Pharisaic regulations often led people away from the commandments and living righteously, um, devouring one another, fighting, um, fighting one another. In the same way, uh, this doctrine, it could be expressed in many different ways. The doctrine of justification by faith alone, the doctrine of salvation by grace through faith alone, for the glory of God alone. It's like these sort of things. They're they're propositional statements. They have no power uh, to um, transform the life. They're just propositional statements. They sound good. They're pious statements, uh, but they have no effect or power in uh, overcoming flesh, in uh, overcoming sin. That's certainly some. Those are overcoming the flesh and overcoming sin is certainly things that are mandated upon the believer, the disciple, the one who follows after Messiah. Um, those are non-negotiable. Um, it is a process, but those are non-negotiable. Paul says, "He who names the name of Jesus must depart from evil, and the Lord knows who are his." Um, must must depart from evil. Um, as Yeshua says, "Go and sin no more." Uh, that's not a sentiment. Uh, Grace comes, has appeared to all men, teaching us to live godly lives, and to put to death the evil deeds of the flesh, the fruits uh, of the flesh. So that's what the grace of God does. It teaches us to abstain from evil. So that's the view that we should have. Now, the two other interpretations, commentaries that I provided, they lead to quite a different um, outcome when we internalize that sort of reading and we understand we don't want the traditions of men. We don't want these doctrines that lead us away from God's word, that lead us away from his commandments into um, thinking that it's okay. We're just always going to struggle with sin uh, because God did all the work. Jesus fulfilled all the law for us, so we don't have to. That's a lot of weird stuff to me. It's always seemed weird. I'm grew up in evangelicalism. It was the air that I breathed, but it was just like stuff like that is just weird to me. And when I read, when I start to take in these other exegetical works and that are more in depth, uh, and have a lot more data points from the Bible, from uh, outside sources, and bringing that all together to create this better, more accurate picture of Paul's context. And then that's the point. That's the point of this channel. Let's get a clear picture of the biblical text and its context and its history and its situation and the rhetorical situation, the social situation, the religious situation. And then when we've done that, when we spend enough time and we've kind of percolated and marinated in that enough, then we could make right application. And that's when hermeneutics can begin. But first, we had to begin with exegetics, with not with apologetics. We need to stay away from apologetics Bible studies. That's not what we need. All right. Well, let's see. Yep. Okay. I've spent enough time monologuing. Hey folks, if you enjoyed this episode and the content, please like the video and leave a comment below, and definitely subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you can be sure to catch more content like this as it comes. Until next time, think deep.